Great. Hi, and welcome to the Tunisia caucus. Welcome to the Harvard Kennedy School. And I'm really, really happy and delighted to be with you today. I am Mohamed Haddad. I am a Tunisian student in the Harvard Kennedy School. My program is the Mid-Career Master of Public Administration. Thank you all for being here. I'm really happy and delighted again to see you. I've been sharing before the start of this webinar, let's say the presentation of our guest today and our topic. And for us, it's not only a happy day because we are receiving Fadhel Kaboub that we will present in a few seconds, but also because this is the official kick-off of the Tunisia Caucus, student organization at the Harvard Kennedy School. This is our official first event, and we are really thrilled to start today with this topic. Beyond the neoliberal model, is modern monetary theory meaningful to Tunisia? Nesrine, which is just in front of me, can you maybe set your camera on your laptop?
I guess I will also be taking off the mask. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to see you all today. My name is Nesrine Mbarek. I am a master in public policy student at HKS. And today, basically the session that we're presenting is by Tunisians and addressed to Tunisians and others interested in the country and in common challenges in the global South. The starting framework is not about Tunisian exceptionalism. It's about studying the actual material conditions that we have in the country. So we're up against this concept of the Tunisian exceptionalism narrative because it served as an analytical shortcut in the past, most often used by foreign viewers, either unwilling to delve into the socioeconomic and historical complexities of the country, or prescribed to analyses that view the Middle East and North Africa as this monolithic and only as sort of stubbornly undemocratic. And Tunisia sort of seemed to them like this exception coming out of the region. So in the end, every material context is unique. Every country is exceptional in its own way. And at the same time, there are common challenges across the global South that we are facing. And so this makes the framework of exceptionalism useless. And so if we were to reflect on the past 10 years, the political and economic issues that prompted the 2011 popular uprisings in Tunisia not only remain unresolved, but they actually have deepened in the past 10 years. So socioeconomic exclusion, neoliberal economic restructuring, and the unbroken rule of the old political and business classes are the historical roots of this crisis. The latest episode of which is the July 25th coup in Tunisia. And so today we have the distinct pleasure of having Professor Fadhel Kaboub with us, and he will be talking about modern monetary theory. And to give a little bit of background, Professor Fadhel Kaboub is an associate professor of economics at Denison University and the president of the Global Institute of Sustainable Prosperity. He has held research affiliations with the Levy Economics Institute, the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard here, and the Economic Research Forum. He's an expert on modern monetary theory, the Green New Deal, and the job guarantee. His work focuses on public policies to enhance monetary and economic sovereignty in the global South, build resilience, and to promote equitable and sustainable prosperity. His academic work has been published in several journals, including the Journal of Economic Issues, the Review of Keynesian Economics, the Review of Radical Political Economics, and the International Journal of Political Economy and International Labor Review. His recent work has also been featured in the New York Times, Financial Times, Bloomberg, Le Monde, Al Jazeera, and several other pathways. So Professor Fadhel, We leave the word to you now.
Thank you, Nesrine. It looks like I'm unable to unmute my camera or turn on my camera, and it looks like I'm also not able to share screen yet. But thank you for the invitation and for the nice introduction. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's an honor to join you in launching the Tunisia caucus at the Harvard Kennedy School. It looks like I'm able to share screen, and let me see if I'm able to turn on the camera as well. Okay, it looks like it's on. Let me make sure I can display this on full screen. Nesrine, are you able to see my screen?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, perfect. So the question we wanted to address today in the context of everything that's been happening, I guess, since July 25th, I wasn't sure, Nesrine or Mohamed, if you wanted to start with a little bit of background before I go into the presentation, or you wanted me to do a brief overview.
That would be great. So basically, I thought that I will jump over it because we had some technical issue, but yeah, I could.
Maybe you should start with the background, Mohamed, and then I'll take it from there.
Thank you again for the initiative, Fadhel. And here you go. So I know that there are a lot of people who are very familiar with Tunisia and with the things I'm going to say right now, but basically for all our friends, our participants who just don't see exactly what are the main trends or the main events in Tunisian history, I propose this slide just to show you, let's say, on one hand, the official dates, on the other hand, the things that we sometimes forget and that are symbolic and that are in the minds of all Tunisians. So basically, the main official dates would be the dates in circles: 56, the independence; 87, the coup d'état médical, as we say, that Ben Ali did, and Ben Ali took over the power. 2011. It's the time for the uprising, and recently the post-July 25th Tunisia, and then I think we are not going to answer the question about a coup or not a coup, even if the debate is really interesting. These are the main dates. However, there are some, let's say, minor events that official history, or let's say history, don't talk about it enough, which, in my opinion, which are the presidency for life decided in 1974 by Bourguiba. I mean, he did not decide it himself, but he did not decline it either. Then the first general strike that happened in January 1978, that was a shock for Bourguiba because he saw himself as the savior. But a few years after, there were the bread riots, and I insist on the 1884 events because the economic situation and the political situation and the arrests that we have been, that Tunisia have been through at that time, could remind us, even if history does not repeat itself, but could remind us where we are today. Then in the Zine al-Abidine Ben Ali era, there is the 2001 referendum that allowed him to get rid of the terms limit. This is important for us. Why? Because few weeks ago, 75 days ago, precisely, President Kais Saied, in a way, just suspended the institutions, dismissed the government, and started ruling by presidential decrees. And keeping in mind how the legislation, the constitution are tailored all along the post-independence Tunisia, is important to keep in mind. In 2008, we had the mining region revolt in Rdaïf in Gafsa in the southeast west of the country. Some sociologists or political scientists consider that these were like the first, let's say, raise of revolt or end of the regime. And we won't need answer if this is true or not, or enter in these historiography theories. But it's interesting that few years later, 3 years later, basically the regime collapsed. Then the 2014 constitution that is suspended today was adopted after 3 years of very, very, very hard negotiation and discussion in the Constituent Assembly. And in 2019, the general elections, where President Kais Saied, just to give you the full dimension, the full scope of the story, I mean, President Kais Saied gathered more votes in the second round of the elections than the votes at the parliament, all the parliament had on a few weeks earlier. So it's interesting to keep in mind this context. The situation today is blurry. There is a lack of clarity. But as you maybe read before the starting of the event, the political actors have changed, but I mean, the economic stage has remained the same. And I think that, Fadhel, you will delve into this fact, this reality more in depth, and the floor is yours now, so that you take us in a journey with this question: is MMT meaningful for Tunisia? And the idea is not to say, okay, let's bring MMT from the West and apply it in Tunisia. No, the idea is just to say, okay, there are other paths. Let's try and see what are the potential other ways we can take through, we can go through. Please, Fadhel,
okay.
The floor
Wonderful.
is yours.
Thank you. Thank you again for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. So I think, Mohamed, you said it in one line, that we've been changing the actors, but keeping the same economic model, essentially. And that's really the main message that I want to deliver today. With 10 different administrations since 2011, and all political parties on the main platforms, essentially using and abusing the same economic model that the Ben Ali regime used, that we've been using since the 70s. And it appears that the Kais Saied administration is also pursuing more or less the same economic model. And I'd like to suggest that with some MMT insights, not only are we able to detect some of the structural weaknesses of this neoliberal model, but also be able to demonstrate that Tunisia is actually capable of transitioning to a different kind of economic model, and that we can actually afford it and be able to do it without causing inflation, without bankrupting the country. As a matter of fact, taming some of the inflationary pressures in that process. So with that in mind, let's start with kind of a little bit of detective work, detecting the structural problems that we've seen in the Tunisian economy. And to be honest, in many, many countries in the global south, this is really a neo-colonial extractive economic development model that I'm describing here. We have structural trade deficits for reasons that I'll explain in a minute. And these structural deficits continuously accumulate external debt for Tunisia. And by external debt, I don't mean government debt denominated in Tunisian dinars. I mean external as in denominated in dollars, euros, and Japanese yen in the case of Tunisia. And this external debt becomes a trap, a structural trap. And when you look at the root causes of the trade deficit, as a result, the root causes of this external debt trap, we identify three major sources. One is massive amount of energy imports. So the lack of energy sovereignty is critical for the global south, for Tunisia in particular. And number two, the lack of food security, the lack of food sovereignty. So massive amount of food imports. And then the third component, which is related to the type of industrialization that we've pursued in Tunisia since the 70s. It's a low value added content of exports relative to the higher value added content of imports. And that is, again, typical for Tunisia and for many countries in the global south. And just a quick comment here on the importance, the vital importance of energy and food. You basically can't run a country, you can't run an economy without food, without energy. So this makes them extremely sensitive, not just from an economic structural problem, but from a social and political stability perspective. And you've mentioned the food riots and the food inflation that Tunisia is experiencing right now is related to that. So then the mechanics of how these factors actually translate into further instability and force us deeper into the trap is the following. And I'll do it step by step so we know the gymnastics of this story. So you have trade deficits naturally create downward pressure on the value of the dinar relative to the dollar and the euro. So it weakens the currency. And a weaker currency means everything Tunisia is going to import the next morning, whether it's wheat, whether it's any kind of food, medicine, fuel, anything that we import with the weaker currency is going to be imported at a higher price, which means we're literally importing inflation. And that's actually the major sources of inflation are related to imports. And as soon as you import food and fuel and medicine at higher prices, you're facing a serious social and political dilemma. Number one, you don't do anything about it, and you essentially let riots take off, which did happen in many countries, including in Tunisia. Number two, the government worries about purchasing power, worries about social stability and political stability, and steps in order to artificially subsidize food and fuel prices, steps in order to artificially keep the exchange rate artificially strong. And keeping the exchange rate artificially strong, meaning intervening and borrowing dollars and euros and Japanese yen to strengthen the interest rate. And that's typically the band-aid solution that most countries, Tunisia included, pursue. That's the band-aid solution that the IMF typically recommends. That's typically what mainstream central bankers try to do by fixing the exchange rate or managing the exchange rate in order to minimize that. And in order to do that, you have to have access to dollars, euros, Japanese yen, British pounds in order to do that artificial stabilization of the exchange rate. Now, where do you get those dollars and euros from? Well, you can borrow them from the IMF, you can borrow them from GCC countries in the Middle East, you can try to earn those dollars via exports, via foreign direct investment, via tourism revenues. I'll go through the whole list and see why none of those solutions is actually structurally transformative. All of them are actually perpetuating this trap. But that's really the core of the economic problem. Let's look at some numbers. And you'll see here for the Tunisians watching us here, 1972 is a critical year. Loi 72 is the law that was introduced at the time in order to encourage export-led growth. And as soon as we did that, as soon as we tried to accelerate our industrialization via export-led growth, look at what happened to the trade balance. We immediately end up importing more fuel, end up importing more capital, more intermediate goods, and we specialize in basically the low-cost assembly line type of work. So value added of what you import is high, value added of what you export is low, and that becomes a perpetual trap. The flip side of this trade imbalance becomes the external debt, which has been accelerating, in perpetuity since 1972. And we're in the same situation today. We're actually at a crisis moment, just like we were at a crisis moment in the mid-80s with the debt crisis, the global South debt crisis. We're in a similar situation right now. Just a quick look at the composition of Tunisia's exports and Tunisia's imports. Those of you at HKS will recognize where this is coming from. The Hussman research team has produced this fantastic database for all countries. So you can just eyeball the categories of exports that Tunisia has and kind of think about the value added content of those products. You see a lot of olive oil, a lot of intermediate products that go into assembly lines in the automobile industry in Germany and France and other places. So kind of the lower value added content that go into the global supply chain. Lots of textiles with low cost labor for exports and so on. And when you flip and look at the import side, not only do you see the imbalance, you have about $4 billion difference. This is 2019 pre-COVID, but you see the massive amount of energy imports that Tunisia has, the massive amount of wheat imports and other foods, and the much, much higher value-added content of what we import in terms of medical equipment and medicine, automobiles, and much more expensive value-added products that are not produced in Tunisia, obviously. This is a classic case. Our situation is not as bad as other developing countries, but it's still part of the same club. So the mainstream economic model, the standard approach about how to get out of this trap, this poverty trap, this perpetual crisis trap. One is austerity. You have to live within your means, balance government budgets, restructure debt so that you can temporarily manage your finances. Privatizing state-owned enterprises. This is something that Tunisia has done in the 1990s and early 2000s. Essentially, you privatize the airport, the airline, the electric power company, the telecom company, whatever state-owned enterprises you have. You sell them. The idea is that you're going to have transfer of technology, much more efficiency, and things like that. But most importantly, you're going to sell this to foreign investors and bring in hundreds of millions of dollars that you can use to pay off the debt. Well, the problem is once you do that once, you can't privatize the airport twice. You can't privatize the telecom twice. You spend the money and then you're back in the same trap. You're back to square one. Many countries, obviously in the global south, have already done that. Labor market flexibility. This is a code word from the World Bank, basically, to go after labor unions, to keep wages down, to keep strikes, mostly impossible. And these are things that are very socially and politically sensitive, obviously, but it's really about lowering the cost and racing to the bottom in order to attract foreign direct investment and make business more profitable for investors. The major driver is foreign direct investment and export-led growth. And both of these, because of the type of industrialization that we've pursued in Tunisia and the global south, produce what we call the negative terms of trade. That is, you export low value added content and you import high value added content. You're constantly trapped. No matter how fast you try to accelerate your exports, you end up importing even more in order to keep up, especially when you don't have energy sovereignty or energy security. Energy imports become extremely challenging and extremely expensive, especially when oil prices and natural gas prices move against you in the global economy. FDI is even more extractive because the profits generated by foreign direct investment are not reinvested in the country. They're actually repatriated. So it's actually even more extractive than export-led growth itself. And there's very little evidence of transfer of technology or know-how from the type of FDI that we receive in Tunisia, that we receive in the global south, essentially, because we're a component of a global supply chain. We're not in the leadership position of deciding what goes into the global supply chain. The next item is financial liberalization. Set up a mini Wall Street, attract foreign investment. And this is really something that we've seen cause a lot of damage in countries like South Africa and Turkey and Russia. As soon as you open your financial markets to financial speculators, essentially, you end up with a speculative bubble followed by a crash and a lot of economic damage. Because why would an investor, go to Tunisia or South Africa or Turkey's financial market instead of London or New York? Because you're offering them lower taxes, no regulations, and you're committing to, making their investments as profitable as possible, giving them a profit margin that's slightly higher than other major markets. So you're essentially faking it to attract primarily speculators. The speculators will buy low and sell high and then get out. Tourism, this is a major issue in Tunisia that for a long time was considered the kind of the crown jewel of the Tunisian economy, so to speak, because it does create a lot of jobs and it does bring foreign direct foreign currency reserves to the country. But what most of us have been neglecting and ignoring for a long time is that tourism is actually also a huge drain of foreign currency reserves, because we don't have food sovereignty and energy sovereignty. When you bring millions of tourists into the country, you have to feed them, so you import more food. You have to transport them, heat and cool the hotels, which means you import a lot of energy as well. So the net amount is not necessarily the net benefit that we thought it would be. So we have to be very careful with the type of tourism. Not all tourism is extractive, and not all tourism is beneficial. So thinking in a much more strategic way about ecotourism and the kind of tourism that we want to have in Tunisia is going to be a critical question for the country in the next few years. And building food sovereignty and energy sovereignty will automatically make tourism a much stronger industry in Tunisia. Now, in addition to the other regional security issues and domestic stability issues, of course. Remittances, people working, Tunisians working abroad, sending money back home. This is not the way you want to develop a country, because it's obviously a huge contributor to brain drain. But for a long time, this has been a significant feature of the Tunisian economy, and I'm sad to say that in the recent months, this has become the main source of foreign currency transfers into Tunisia, which says a lot about the state of the country. So we're in this perpetual race to the bottom that leads to more external debt, that leads to the conclusion that there is no alternative. There's nothing we can do. This is what the mainstream model says. Just tighten your belts and work harder. But the more you do, the deeper you get into this trap. You're not actually getting out of the trap. So the only way out, because of the structural sources of this debt trap, are related to food and energy and the type of value-added content manufacturing that we have in Tunisia. The only way out has to be built on a strategy for renewable energy policy, to build energy sovereignty domestically and to close that gap in the trade balance that comes from fossil fuel imports. The food component, it has to be a solution based on sustainable agricultural policy, water and energy management, conservation policies. All of these things are a win-win in terms of economic structural transformation, but also in terms of the climate crisis that Tunisia is facing right now. Tunisia is one of the most vulnerable countries when it comes to climate change. And then when it comes to international trade, because we're not arguing for isolation, we produce our energy, we produce our food, and we're not going to trade. Absolutely not. As a small size country, we can't go into isolationism. We can't go back to pre-1960s type of ideas, but we have to have a very different strategic international trade policy. And here I'd like to argue for South-South trade policy. And I'll explain why. And I'll use a metaphor here that a lot of people are familiar with. When you think of international trade and free trade and all that, you hear all these references to competition. Competition is healthy, just like in sports. Competition is good for you. It makes you stronger. It makes you more competitive. It lowers costs. It lowers prices. It improves service to customers. It increases all of these great things. But yeah, in sports, competition is healthy, but we would never allow a heavyweight boxing champion to compete in the same ring with a lightweight boxing champion, and we call it healthy, and we call competition is good, it makes you stronger. It's illegal, it's ugly, nobody would watch it, and yet we allow that. We allow a heavyweight industrial country or groups of countries in the global north to compete with lightweight industrial countries in the global south, and we call it fair. We're basically destroying economic resources and economic infrastructure in the global south. So competition within the global north is healthy. Competition within the global south is healthy, and especially if we form it and organize it in a strategic way that actually benefits everyone. So there's quite a bit of literature on South-South trade policies and industrial policies. I'm happy to elaborate later. Focus on value added. So value added driven industrial policy, not everything goes. And I said this before, I always say we have a Ministry of Industry, but we don't have an industrial policy. We have a Ministry of Agriculture, but we don't have an agricultural policy, in the sense that Our industrial policy is really to do whatever the global north needs in terms of fitting into the global supply chain. They need somebody to produce cables, we'll produce cables. They need somebody to produce tires, we'll produce tires. That's not our industrial policy. That's the industrial policy of the multinationals in the global north who happen to need a low-cost producer in Tunisia to produce the tires. So that's not our strategy. We need to think much more strategically about what we actually produce for what reason, and prioritize value-added content, prioritize the resilience of the Tunisian economy. And this could be done via a job guarantee program that allows you to gradually reclaim monetary sovereignty. So here I'm going into the MMT space. What is this monetary sovereignty? So you can have employment-led growth focused on building productive capacity in strategic areas, starting with food, starting with energy, and then building from there. So the question becomes, can we afford it? Who's going to pay for it? Where will the money come from? We're already deep in debt, and I'm saying we need to spend more and employ more people to build this strategic industrial policy and food security and energy security and so on. So here comes the MMT framework, modern monetary theory, for those of you who are not very familiar with the concept. MMT always talks about the spectrum of monetary sovereignty. It's misleading to say that all countries have monetary sovereignty because they print their own money. Well, that's only part of the story. But in this case, if you look at the spectrum, you have countries with very high degrees of monetary sovereignty, countries with no monetary sovereignty whatsoever, and countries that are somewhere in between. Tunisia, I would argue, is somewhere in between. We'll talk about what determines where you sit on that spectrum of monetary sovereignty and how you can use strategic economic policies, MMT-informed policies, in order to gradually increase the degree of your monetary sovereignty. But basically, countries that have no monetary sovereignty are countries that essentially use a foreign currency. The example would be countries like Ecuador that completely dollarize their economy, kind of give up the national monetary sovereignty. Countries on this end of the spectrum with the highest level of monetary sovereignty are countries like the US, countries like Japan, the UK, Canada, Australia, and so on. These are countries that issue their own currency, check. Countries that collect taxes in their national currency, check, that's number 2. And these are countries that never borrow, never issue debt denominated in foreign currencies. That is, the entire US debt stock is in US dollars. The entire Japanese debt stock is in Japanese dollars. And then as a result of that, you see that some countries like Tunisia, we issue debt denominated in dinar for the local market, but we also issue bonds, we issue government debt denominated in dollars, euros, Japanese yen, and so on. And that's how we lose part of our monetary sovereignty, and we move to a lower degree of monetary sovereignty, which creates structural constraints that I'll talk about in a minute. And the reason why we end up borrowing in foreign currencies is because of those structural weaknesses that I described, lack of food sovereignty, energy sovereignty, and so on. So to reclaim your monetary sovereignty, it's not something that you declare by decree. It's something that you actually earn through hard work, through strategic investments in order to reclaim that monetary sovereignty and move to a higher degree of monetary sovereignty. And when you move to the higher degree of monetary sovereignty, you're automatically increasing the fiscal spending capacity that you have, and you're actually taming the sources of inflation in that process, which I'll explain in a second. So I just explained what is monetary sovereignty in simple terms here. The implication of achieving that degree of monetary sovereignty is this number 4 bullet point here, which is you end up actually in a situation where you don't have to fix your exchange rate to the dollar or to the euro or to any other foreign currency. So you can actually adopt a flexible exchange rate and have enough structural resilience to any kind of external shocks that may affect your exchange rate, you can affect your trade balance. And of course, if you don't have food security and energy security, those are the first few items that will hurt the most as soon as you have an external shock, as soon as you have exchange rate fluctuations. So very important to distinguish from an MMT perspective the financial position of a currency issuer, like a sovereign government that completely controls its financial system, versus currency users like you and I, who actually have to work hard and earn an income in order to spend it, or have to borrow it in order to spend it. Once you borrow, you have a serious debt that you have to pay off through hard work and so on. So here, monetary sovereignty, the concept is not for users, the concept is for issuers of national currency. So don't try this at home. This is for monetary sovereigns. So then the question becomes, how much can a country like Tunisia spend safely without causing inflation? Because the dinar is not something that we have to borrow from the US or from the IMF. It's the sovereign currency of the state. So the question is, how much can we spend? In other words, how large can the domestic government deficit be before we face a scenario like Venezuela's hyperinflation and all of that? The mainstream approach tells us, well, you collect tax revenues and you borrow from the domestic market up to a certain limit. And beyond that, you really shouldn't even try, because that will get you into a hyperinflation cycle. MMT is essentially saying there's this additional spending capacity, this bright yellow space that we're not tapping into. And we're saying it's not infinite. It's actually constrained by this red bar, which is the actual risk of inflation. So the exercise of deciding how much spending can the government do, it becomes automatically an exercise in detecting the sources of inflation and determining where inflation risk lies. And once you detect that, you start developing strategies to tame the risk of inflation. And that's what allows you into the bright yellow space. Otherwise, you're actually constrained in the way that the mainstream says you're constrained. So what determines the risk of inflation? According to MMT, it's two key components. One is the lack of productive capacity. In other words, if you don't have enough productive capacity for food, for energy, you're going to face a risk of inflation. The good news about this is that you can build productive capacity, create thousands of jobs. And when you do that, you gradually tame the risk of inflation. And number two, which is the most important item here in the case of Tunisia, and I think this is an item that Tunisians have been wrestling with for the last 10 years since the uprisings of 2011, administration after administration, especially the Kais Saied administration, I would say, is the abusive market power of price setters in the domestic economy. That is to say, you have key players who can actually raise prices simply because they can, or because we let them, because there isn't enough antitrust regulations or enforcement antitrust regulations, because there is structural, legal, political settings that have given exclusive market power to a handful of individuals, dating back to the Ben Ali regime and even before, to be honest. And those two sources of inflation, if you strategically target them and tame those sources, you can essentially get into that brighter yellow space of additional spending capacity to build more productive capacity and tame the risk of inflation. And I'll illustrate with an example in a second. But the most important thing about the second source of inflation, the abusive market power, that's not a market power that you're going to eliminate by spending less, by pursuing austerity. That market power can only be eliminated by taxing and regulating this market power out of existence. So it's not spending less, it's actually going after it with taxing and regulatory powers and legal means, essentially. And that's really the paradigm shift that MMT is suggesting here, that spending more strategically is actually the way to tame inflation, not spending less and pursuing austerity and remaining within the trap. I'll give you an example to illustrate. And yes, I did say it, increasing government spending to fight inflation doesn't make sense from a mainstream perspective. But hear me out. First, here's the mainstream perspective. Let's follow this scenario, the mainstream approach. If Tunisia today decides to spend 2 billion dinars on health and education, very important areas, what's going to happen according to the mainstream narrative? You're going to have more imports of food and energy and medical equipment and laptops and all that. We're going to have a larger trade deficit, a weaker exchange rate, a pass-through inflation effect, maybe even hyperinflation if we continue doing this forever, more external debt. And as a result, the IMF and foreign lenders will step in and say, you need austerity, too much spending, too much debt. So we're going to have less investment in health and education. We're back to square one. We're going to have more unemployment, brain drain, social, economic, political tensions, and we're told there is no alternative. We told you shouldn't spend the money in the first place. Austerity, austerity. This is what Margaret Thatcher has been telling us since the 1980s. There is no alternative. Well, I'd like to suggest the MMT alternative, which is, again, the same hypothetical example, spending 2 billion dinars, but now the spending is going to be much more strategic and transformative and aiming at the sources of inflation as opposed to avoiding them. We're going to spend 1 billion dinars on health and education instead of 2. And then the second billion we're going to spend it on domestic productive capacity increase in food security and energy security, renewable energy, energy efficiency, and using the taxing and regulatory power of the state to crack down on corruption, abusive price setters, importers of luxury goods via taxation and regulation. So the same amount of dinars spent, but strategically in a different way. Here's the impact. Fewer imports of food and energy because we're producing more domestically. Lower trade deficit as a result. A stable or even stronger exchange rate, everything else equal. No pass-through inflation effect because we're not importing as much food and fuel. Lower external debt over time. Even higher credit rating by credit rating agencies. We're going to have an increase in foreign currency reserves. And as a result, more resilience to external shocks related to food and energy security, lower carbon footprint because we're doing the right thing domestically, and more employment, less brain drain, and improved quality of life for everyone. This is it. And now that we discover that we can do this with 2 billion dinars, so increasing the deficit, but actually taming the sources of inflation and structurally beginning to transform the composition of the economy, now the limit is not necessarily 2 billion. Maybe it's 3, maybe it's 7, maybe it's 10. What determines how much we can spend is actually our capacity to logistically, administratively manage the implementation of these programs, having the skills and the actual productive capacity to do it. Those are the real constraints, not the financial constraints, not the external debt. And then finally, I'll close with the industrial policy component, because I focused on food and energy first and the inflation sources. Now, in terms of international trade, how do we strategically develop industries that actually build resilience as opposed to the extractive industries that we've had? And here, strategic partnership in the global south is important. Number one, because as a small country with 10, 12 million consumers, you can't really hit economies of scale with a small market domestically. So you have to have access to foreign markets, except foreign markets, you're not really competitive under the current system unless you become part of the global supply chain. Here, having access to a larger consumer market in the global south allows you to industrialize and hit economies of scale in a more strategic way. Focusing on complementary resources and capabilities within the trading bloc. Of course, there's an implicit assumption here about the political will, not only in Tunisia, but also in other partner countries, recognizing that they're in the same boat, essentially. So sharing capabilities and resources, building horizontal linkages that focus on value-added content within the trading bloc, and that becomes the core of the strategy, and focus on collective resilience by starting with food security, renewable energy security, water security, education, training, healthcare, building from the foundations as opposed to exporting and producing anything that the global north needs for its own purposes, right? So building a domestic regional strategy. And this is how a country over time acquires a higher degree of economic and monetary sovereignty. And I would argue that if a country or a regional bloc lacks this basic level of resilience, it has no bargaining chips. It can't walk away from a negotiation table, and it will continue to lose its economic and monetary sovereignty over time. So that's really the main message I wanted to deliver today, that if we don't have long-term strategic visions that focus on the root causes of the problem, we're going to be trapped in the same model that the Bourguiba administration used since the 70s, the Ben Ali administration used for decades, and unfortunately the last 10 years we've pursued more or less the same strategy. And I'm almost convinced that the Kais Saied vision in his administration is more or less still within the same framework, unfortunately. And with that, I'm happy to take questions and engage in conversation. Thank you again.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Fadhel, for this presentation. Very, very, very insightful. There's a bunch of questions in the Q&A, and we can start by Shaima's question. I don't know if you have access to the Q&A window. So basically what Shaima asked is, are there comparable examples of countries that managed to shift to the right track? What were success factors? What would you answer, Fadhel?
I can't claim that there is a country that has, completely understood the MMT framework and pursued it, but I can give you examples of countries that focused on key items related to value-added content type of industrialization. And there's lots of examples. Think of Singapore, think of South Korea in particular, Taiwan. These are countries that decided to climb up the ladder, so to speak, and avoid being the lowest cost producer for the global supply chain. And you can't do it, by hoping that the global north will send you the right industries. You actually have to build the skills, the infrastructure, the technical vocational capabilities, and become more strategic, more selective in the type of foreign direct investment that you would like to attract and the type of export-led growth that you would like to encourage, and do it via industrial policy. It's not going to happen by accident. Unfortunately, many countries in the global south, Tunisia included, have essentially completely given up on the idea of industrial policy, other than doing whatever the export-led industry needs to support them, which means serving the interest in the industrial strategies of multinational corporations and the global north.
Thank you again. Nesrine, do you want to take the next question?
Yeah, sure. So another question we have is from Fadhel. She asks, can the government actually finance these spendings given the current central banks, and namely Marwan Abbasi's monetary policies, obsessed with fighting inflation with abusively high interest rates?
Excellent question. Under the current setting and vision of central bank policy, I would say no. And that's really what I'm trying to suggest here, that we need a paradigm shift in the way we think about public policy. So when we say the central bank is obsessed with the risk of inflation, what I'm suggesting here is that the actual sources of inflation that the central bank wants to fight in Tunisia, and by the way, in other countries too, including in the US, the sources of inflation are way outside the jurisdiction of the central bank. If the source of inflation has to do with the price of oil, which is set by OPEC, how will the central bank fight it? You can't convince OPEC to lower their prices. So you're essentially doing whatever you can, giving whatever you have in your toolbox, but you're not impacting the source of inflation. If one of the major sources of inflation we have in Tunisia are wheat imports, because we import from the Ukraine and Russia and Australia and the US, these are the global suppliers who actually control prices. How will the central bank actually raise interest rate or lower the interest rate or do anything within the central bank that will actually change the global pricing of wheat and other key necessities? So what I'm suggesting is that the actual inflation targeting strategy, the most effective inflation targeting strategy, is not in the hands of the central bank. It's in the hands of the Ministry of Agriculture. It's in the hands of the Ministry of Energy. It's in the hands of Ministry of Trade. It's in the hands of the fiscal authorities, which means president and parliament and whatever administration we have. And that is the paradigm shift that MMT is trying to suggest, that we can actually increase the spending, which means increase the deficit, but doing it strategically so that you actually aim at the sources of inflation. And there is nothing the central bank can do other than band-aid solutions and kind of the artificial, exchange rate stability settings that actually tame the sources of inflation in the most painful way, which is you create mass unemployment in order to weaken the purchasing power of consumers so that you reduce demand for energy, demand for food, demand for medicine. Essentially, suffering is the strategy to reduce inflation. And that is just unacceptable. and ineffective.
That was important. We have a question from an anonymous participant who said, how to navigate MMT with political instability? How would you answer that one?
Yeah, very good question. I mean, this is the stuff that we should have done in 2011, in 2012. These are the things that we should have done. Obviously, the most difficult time is to do it in the middle of a crisis, political crisis, economic crisis. But you still have to acknowledge that if you're in a deep hole, right, which is what we're in right now, the first thing you need to do is you stop digging and you figure out a way out. And what we've been told is that you need to dig faster and do it without corruption, but dig faster. And that's really the idea here. So how can Tunisia get out of this crisis in a strategic way with some MMT insights? So a couple of things. One, you need immediate stabilization, which means dealing with the forthcoming deadlines for debt payments. And there's quite a few of them coming up. By mid-April, we're going to have hundreds of millions of dollars worth of external debt payments due. And that's really the panicking moment that we're facing right now, is when those deadlines close and you miss debt payments, then you're in a chaotic situation where you can't borrow anymore. And any refinancing of the debt is going to be much, much more expensive, much more costly. And as a result, you'll be left with only, you will not be able to borrow from capital markets. You're left with bilateral agreements, either with the IMF, with the World Bank, or with friendly countries who would be willing to step in and help you. And if none of that happens, you immediately face the food riot situation that I described, because everything the dinar will weaken, everything we import will become more expensive. And that's really the position where you lose even more of your sovereignty, not just monetary, but political sovereignty, because then your economic policy agenda, your social policy agenda, your political agenda will be set by outsiders for a variety of reasons. And you can't blame, other players for having their own interests and their own strategies in mind. So to avoid that, we have to start thinking immediately right now, how do we manage to reschedule, postpone, manage to find friendly nations who will actually help us through the debt payment cycle, but then use our domestic spending capacity strategically, immediately, to build the resilience that I'm talking about. It's a no-brainer that once you start producing more renewable energy domestically, you'll be importing less fuel, which means your external debt next year will be lower. So you'll be actually fixing the problem. Once you start investing more in sustainable agriculture and reprioritize agricultural allocation of resources. I use this example all the time, which is insanity. We subsidize fruit exports, especially things like strawberries, which are massive consumers of water. And we give strawberry producers the most fertile land. Why? Because we want to export strawberries and generate dollars and euros to pay the debt. And at the same time, strawberries are not necessary for Tunisia's food security or food sovereignty, but wheat is. So we import wheat from other countries when we can be reallocating resources, the most precious land, the most precious water resources, to build resilience first. And that's what it means to have an agricultural policy. Our agricultural policy is to provide cheap strawberries for Europeans. That doesn't help our sovereignty in food or food security. So that's the kind of thinking we need to start implementing immediately.
Just to a quick follow-up on what you said, Fadhel. This is not like fantasy. Just after the Second World War, Tunisia and North Africa has been exporting grains and cereals to Europe till the 70s. And meanwhile, the European community at that time had a clear strategy, which is supporting, which is clearly not food security, but food sovereignty. And once the wheat became less expensive in Europe than in North Africa, North African countries preferred the easy way, which is to buy wheat from Europe. But
it didn't happen by accident. As you know, this was the common agricultural policy. This is CAP, which as soon as it was introduced, the Global South lost its food sovereignty and food security and became a net importer of food.
Nesrine has questions for you.
Indeed, we actually do have quite a bit of questions from the audience. So I'll post to right now a question from Andres Parado. How can we increase South-South trade in a way that to strengthen the value-added economy in Tunisia if the economies we are trading with are mostly low-added value economies? And then a question from Tarek Jalloub. In regards to food subsidy, what can be done to shift the dialogue from public deficit and deadweight loss to fiscal justice and food sovereignty? And we'll see if, hopefully, depending on your answers, we'll see if we have a little bit of time to ask the remaining of the questions.
Sure. I'll start with the more difficult question, which is South-South trade with other countries. So as I said, as I alluded to earlier in the presentation, number one, you have to have a clear understanding in Tunisia about what industrial policy means and how you can do it. And then you discover you can't do it alone because you're a small country and you need access to international markets. So you have to have the political commitment. And by political commitment, I don't mean this president or the next president or the next parliament. This has to be a national policy that has no political affiliation. This is, this is 50-year vision for the country that shouldn't change with parliaments and presidents and whatever. And then the next step is to go to our international partners, especially in the global south, but not necessarily excluding countries in the global north, because countries in the global north who actually understand that a more resilient Tunisia, a more resilient North Africa is more stable, is more prosperous, is actually a benefit to everyone. So the problem is not just our vision in Tunisia and the global south, it's also the global north is still living with the fantasies of the colonial and neo-colonial extractive model being good for everybody. That has to change. But thinking in the global south, you have to have political commitment, because our trap is the same trap that Algeria has, the same trap that Libya has, the same trap that Egypt has. So we're all digging ourselves deeper into these traps when we can build strategic partnerships in order to use complementary resources and capabilities and access to larger markets to start with the most basic areas of resilience, which is food security, food sovereignty for the region, energy sovereignty, renewable energy sovereignty. And we don't have to start competing with Boeing and Airbus. You start with the basics and you build from there. And then you bring in research universities and technical training capabilities so that you actually develop the workforce that you need to staff these millions of jobs to build food security and energy security. And if countries in the global north are able to facilitate with technical assistance, with financial assistance, so be it. And if the EU or the US is not able or willing to do it for strategic reasons, well, we use our economic diplomacy to find the resources somewhere else. It may be China, it may be Russia, it may be other countries. But the key here is not to escape one neo-colonial relationship and fall into the next one. The key is to have our own vision for how do we build this resilience in the region, and then find the right partners who actually understand its benefits and be willing to participate in it on an equal footing. So that's the first question, I think the more difficult question. The second question was about food subsidies, and I forget the exact phrasing.
Yeah, basically what can be done to shift the dialogue from public deficit and deadweight loss to fiscal justice and food sovereignty.
Yeah, so when the reason the government subsidizes food is because it's too expensive and the working class people, lower income individuals can't afford it. Well, the key here is not to continue the subsidies. The key is to create an economy that generates higher incomes so that those individuals don't need the subsidy in the first place. So the subsidy is patchwork that we've been doing for a long time. We're keeping people in poverty, we're keeping people underpaid, we're racing to the bottom and saying, sorry for your situation, we're gonna help you with bread subsidies, with cooking oil subsidies, with transportation subsidies. That's just the wrong mindset. We're not saying eliminate the subsidies and everything will be fine, of course not. The structural transformation that I'm describing will raise quality of life, will raise revenues, will raise incomes for individuals to the point where you make the need for subsidies, especially subsidies of items that are imported, which is where the subsidy is really needed, you make them a moot point. You eliminate the need for subsidies if you have domestic food sovereignty and energy sovereignty. There's no need for subsidizing, because the subsidy is a really artificial way of taming the impact of the exchange rate on domestic prices. So everything I've suggested here is geared in that direction.
Fadhel, we are already over time. So the question is, do you have 2 minutes to answer quickly?
I always have 2 minutes.
Thank you so much.
But I do have another event at 2 o'clock. So.
Yeah, so we will be very short. We will end at in like 2 minutes. So as a kind of a caveat, you mentioned the absence of political will. Isn't that what we also should talk about? Does it form part of MMT? And the second question, in terms of creating jobs, you have labor-intensive sectors in mind. I think, does that apply to energy and food industries too? Any other sector, infrastructure project maybe? So if you can try to give us a mix.
So I missed the second question. Is the second question about what are the labor-intensive sectors that we want to encourage? Was that the question?
He's asking you if you have labor-intensive sectors in mind. Mm-hmm. Does it apply to energy and food?
I see. Yeah. So the first question about does MMT depend on the political will? Well, everything depends on the political will. I would say the political will today is to use monetary policy to throw people under the bus in the name of fighting inflation and stabilizing the exchange rate. Look how well this is working even politically, right? Let alone economically and socially. What MMT is saying is essentially shining a bright light on the world of possibilities. And we're saying there is the possibility to actually do what you want to do, which is kill the sources of inflation, create more jobs, build more resilience. And it happens to be done via more spending, not less spending and austerity. And it happens to be structurally transformative as opposed to kind of band-aid patchwork type of solutions. And it does require a shift in political priorities, a shift in economic priorities, and shift in strategic thinking. That's really what we're saying. You can use MMT insights if you want to introduce very right-wing policies, left-wing policies, centrist policies. We can use MMT ideas to build up more military capabilities, but is that really the priorities? We can build MMT, informed strategies to reduce the tax burden on the wealthy, but is that really a good strategy politically or economically? MMT is just telling you what is your spending capacity, what is the potential risk on the inflation front, what are the sources of inflation, putting the pieces on the puzzle and saying, make your choice. How do you want to deal with this?
Thank you so much, Fadhel. Thank you for your time. Thank you for
my pleasure.
Explaining so clearly this idea of another way of thinking rather than just a financial or economical debate. I know that there are a lot of questions that we did not answer, but this is just our first event. This is not the last. And before thanking everybody, I just want to point out that tomorrow, the Center for Middle Eastern Studies, which is part of the Faculty of Art and Science, is organizing an interview, a webinar with Mohamed. He's an activist and co-founder of iWatch organization. And the debate will be about Tunisia's fight against corruption, actualities, and political uses. I know that there are a lot of people who are interested in Tunisia here, so please, please look for the CMES webpage on Harvard website or on Facebook. You will find the link and whatever. So you'll find everything you need to take part to this. And we are going to send an email to recap what we saw today and to tell you about this. Another thing, November 12th is the deadline for applying for a trip for a field course in Tunisia. But you will have many other details by email. Again, thank you, Nesrine. You've been just in front of me.
I'd like to thank both of you for hosting this event and for all the good work that you're doing at the Kennedy School, and for shining new light and new ways of understanding what's happening in Tunisia on the political front, on the social front, on the economic front. This is And this work needs to be done in Arabic and French and English so that people outside the country can have a better understanding of the issues that we deal with in Tunisia, and as in a way that's different from what you normally see in those little news clips in international media. So thank you again.
That's really meaningful. Thank you so much. See you soon all. Ciao.
Bye-bye.